March 18, 1943, Naval Air Station, Jacksonville, Florida. The morning began like countless others across the Navy's training fields. The hum of engines, the scent of fuel, and the distant rumble of dauntless dive bombers warming up along the flight line. Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" Flatley, one of the Navy's most seasoned aviators, stood watching his students climb into their SBDs, the same aircraft that had helped turn the tide at Midway just 9 months earlier. But beneath the routine, something felt deeply wrong. Flatley had been tracking his squadron's accident reports for weeks, and the numbers made no sense. In just a month and a half, he'd lost more pilots to training accidents than he'd lost in actual combat over the Solomons. These weren't green rookies making rookie mistakes. Many were decorated combat veterans, men who had faced flak and fighters, only to die in clear skies over Florida during peacetime training runs. The pattern was impossible to ignore, and terrifying to explain. Across the country, similar reports trickled in from other bases: Pensacola, Corpus Christi, San Diego. Perfectly good dive bombers were plunging straight into the sea or the ground, their pilots never even attempting recovery. The crashes followed the same grim script: a flawless roll into a 70-degree dive, textbook tracking through the bomb site. Then, nothing. No radio calls, no control input, no sign of panic or mechanical failure. Just impact. Crash teams combing through the wreckage found the same clues every time: engines running smoothly, control surfaces intact, no sign of malfunction. Only one conclusion remained: something was happening to the pilots themselves. The official reports called it failure to recover from dive. But that bland, bureaucratic phrase masked a brutal truth. The dive bombing technique that had won Midway was now killing the men who had mastered it. The precision that made the SBD Dauntless so deadly had become a physiological trap. As Flatley compared notes with other instructors, a grim consensus formed. The pilots dying weren't the careless ones. They were the perfectionists, the by-the-book men who held their dives until the last possible second to ensure pinpoint accuracy. Every 100 feet of extra altitude meant potential inaccuracy on the target. Against a moving ship, even 50 feet of missed distance could mean a wasted bomb. So they held. They waited. They pushed through the last moments of the dive, determined to hit their mark, and never pulled out. At first, investigators looked for mechanical faults, but none existed. The SBD's rugged frame was famous for enduring punishment. It wasn't metal that was failing. It was flesh and blood. Few in the Bureau of Aeronautics wanted to confront the idea that the human body itself was the weak link in naval aviation, but the truth became impossible to ignore once flight surgeons began studying the physics of the dive. A typical Dauntless dive began from around 10,000 feet. The pilot rolled inverted, pulled through into a 70-degree nose-down angle, and accelerated toward 300 miles per hour. At the release point, about 2,500 feet, he'd drop his bomb, then yank back on the stick to begin recovery. That pullout subjected the aircraft and its pilot to between 5 and 7 times the force of gravity. To the airplane, those forces were within limits. To the human body, they were catastrophic. As soon as the pilot hauled back on the stick, his blood obeyed the laws of physics, surging toward his legs and lower torso. Within seconds, his brain was starved of oxygen. First came the gray out, loss of peripheral vision, as if the world were closing in through a tunnel. Then came blackout, where vision disappeared entirely, though consciousness lingered. But if the G-forces climbed just a little higher, consciousness itself winked out. At 6 Gs, the brain received barely a third of its normal blood supply. The mind shut down to protect itself, even as the body continued following its last control input. And that was the fatal timing. From the moment a pilot began pulling out to the moment the wings leveled, barely 6 seconds passed. But blackout could arrive in less than 2. That meant a pilot could be conscious as he started recovery, and unconscious before he finished it. The result was horrifyingly predictable. The stick went slack, the pullout froze mid-arc, and the aircraft slammed into the ocean with its pilot unconscious at the controls. Even worse, some recovered consciousness in the final split second before impact, just long enough to realize what was about to happen. By early 1943, naval flight surgeons and engineers began urgent tests at Pensacola's centrifuge facility. Volunteer pilots were strapped into rotating capsules that simulated the G-loads of a dive bomber pullout. They found that by tightening leg and abdominal muscles, the so-called anti-G straining maneuver, they could delay blackout for a second or two longer. But in combat or training, with eyes fixed on the bomb site, pilots rarely remembered to do it. Their attention was consumed by the target. It was too much for the body and the mind to process at once. The U.S. Navy wasn't the first to face this invisible killer. 4 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had confronted the same problem. During the 1939 invasion of Poland, German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers began mysteriously crashing during recovery. Experienced pilots, even squadron leaders, were dying in droves. At first, the Germans blamed faulty instruments, but flight tests revealed the same culprit: G-induced blackout. Unlike the Americans, however, the Germans had an engineer who refused to accept biology as destiny. His name was Hans Ulrich Rudel, and his solution would change dive bombing forever. Rudel and the Junkers design team created a mechanical safeguard, an automatic pull-out system. Before beginning his dive, a Stuka pilot set a barometric switch to a predetermined recovery altitude. When the aircraft reached that altitude, pneumatic actuators automatically yanked back the control column. Even if the pilot was unconscious, the Stuka would level itself out. A simple red handle allowed manual override, but if the pilot wasn't awake, the machine saved him anyway. The results were dramatic. Within months, dive crash fatalities among Stuka units dropped by more than 80%. Pilots reported regaining consciousness in level flight, with no memory of the recovery. The system worked so well that it even improved accuracy. Pilots could now hold their dives longer, trusting the mechanism to save them at the preset altitude. When American intelligence officers examined captured Stukas in North Africa, they noted the system but dismissed it as over-engineering. American pilots, they believed, didn't need such crutches. They were wrong. In 1943, that same arrogance was costing American lives. By spring, Lieutenant Commander Flatley's training squadrons were losing pilots faster than the combat units in the Pacific. Reports from carrier air groups came in almost weekly. Experienced aviators, dead in perfect dives, their only mistake being precision itself. The Bureau of Aeronautics continued to insist the accidents were isolated, but the numbers were rising, and soon, no one could ignore the pattern any longer. And so, in the skies above Florida, as the Dauntlesses dove once more toward their targets, a silent question hung in the air. Could the Navy's greatest weapon also be its deadliest trap? Because what the pilots didn't yet know was that the next few months would rewrite everything they had ever learned about how to survive. A dive. March 22, 1943, off the coast of Florida. The carrier USS Yorktown was conducting what should have been a routine dive bombing exercise under perfect skies. The sea was calm, the visibility endless of an ideal training day. Among the men of Air Group 3, none were rookies. They were combat veterans from the Solomons, survivors of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, the Navy's best. Lieutenant Robert Chen was one of them. Steady, methodical, and precise, he was the kind of pilot every instructor wished they could clone. That morning, Chen rolled into his dive exactly by the book, 70 degrees nose down, throttle closed, bomb sight aligned, target centered. From the Yorktown's deck, Ensign Marcus Webb tracked Chen's Dauntless through binoculars. Everything looked perfect, until it didn't. Webb watched in disbelief as Chen's aircraft held its dive long past the bomb release point. No pullout, no radio call, no sign of mechanical failure. The SBD stayed locked in its descent until it struck the water at full speed, vanishing in a white plume that hung over the ocean like smoke from a funeral pyre. There was no error to explain, no malfunction to blame, just silence on the radio and another pilot gone. 5 days later, it happened again. Lieutenant William Stamper, Chen's instructor, a decorated veteran who had survived 2 major carrier battles, entered his dive during another training exercise. The observers on deck knew precisely when he should have begun recovery. They watched the altimeter marks tick past 3,000, 2,500, 2,000 feet, still no pullout. The Dauntless stayed on course until it drove itself into the Atlantic. Stamper had been a naval aviator for nearly a decade. If anyone could perform the maneuver in his sleep, it was him. And yet, he too never came out of the dive. That day, the Yorktown's flight deck fell silent. The squadron's commanding officer grounded every dive bomber on board. Enough was enough. When word reached Admiral Mark Mitcher, the hard-driving commander of the Navy's fast carrier task forces, he recognized the pattern for what it was, a systemic crisis. Mitcher ordered the Bureau of Aeronautics to treat these accidents not as isolated tragedies, but as a deadly flaw in the very doctrine that defined American naval aviation. The investigation that followed pulled data from every dive bomber, squadron in the fleet, Navy and Marine Corps. Alike, the results were staggering. Between November 1942 and April 1943-47, American dive bomber pilots had been killed in training alone, more than had been lost to enemy fire during the same period. Combat squadrons were reporting that up to 1 in 5 pilots experienced partial or complete blackouts during actual attacks. Entire sections of bombers had been forced to break off mid-dive when their leaders lost consciousness and plummeted toward the ocean. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a threat to the entire concept of carrier warfare. In early April, the Navy convened an emergency conference at Anacostia Naval Air Station. Gathered around the table were test pilots, flight surgeons, aeronautical engineers, and battle-hardened squadron commanders. For 3 days, they dissected every element of dive bombing, from the physics of the dive to the physiology of the human body. Test pilots performed instrumented dives, wired with sensors tracking heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. High-speed cameras mounted in chase planes filmed their every movement. On the ground, doctors studied frame-by-frame footage of pilots slumping forward in their harnesses, hands loosening from the control stick as consciousness slipped away. The conclusion was inescapable. The Navy's own training, doctrine, the same manual that had built its wartime success, was physically unsustainable. Pilots were being asked to perform a maneuver that the human body could not survive with consistency. The question now was what to do about changing a fundamental combat doctrine wasn't just a matter of writing new instructions. It meant unlearning habits drilled into muscle memory through thousands of hours of training. And for the Navy, accuracy wasn't negotiable. Dive bombing was the fleet's scalpel, its only weapon precise enough to hit moving ships with single-bomb accuracy. How could they make the maneuver safer without sacrificing the precision that gave it meaning? The solution came not from a high-ranking officer or a scientist, but from a quiet, unassuming junior pilot named Lieutenant J.G. Thomas Riley, a veteran of the carrier enterprise. During the conference, Riley raised his hand and admitted that he'd been breaking procedure for months. Instead of releasing his bomb at 2,500 feet, the altitude prescribed by doctrine, he'd been holding his dive longer, down to 2,000, sometimes even 1,800 feet. Only then would he drop the bomb and begin a gentler pullout. It was a confession that, under normal circumstances, might have earned him a reprimand. But Riley wasn't boasting. He was trying to explain something that didn't make sense even to him. Despite diving deeper into danger, his bombing accuracy had improved dramatically. And unlike many of his peers, he'd never once experienced gray-out or blackout during recovery. At first, the senior officers scoffed. One commander accused him of lying, claiming no one could hit a target consistently from that low without misjudging distance or smashing into the ground. The bomb sight tables didn't even include data for releases below 2,000 feet. By the book, it was suicidal, but Riley had proof. He'd brought his gun camera footage, the same automatic film every carrier pilot was required to shoot during combat dives. When the panel projected it frame by frame, the evidence was undeniable. Riley's bombs were striking within 35 feet of center, nearly twice as accurate as the Navy's best doctrinal average. The data forced the engineers to revisit their own assumptions. When aerodynamicists at the Naval Research Laboratory recalculated the trajectory math, they discovered why Riley's unorthodox method worked. At standard release altitudes, the Dauntless dropped its bomb while still in the early stages of recovery, roughly 60 degrees nose down. At that angle, the bomb carried a heavy horizontal component of velocity, meaning wind drift and timing errors could throw accuracy off by dozens of feet. But Riley's low-altitude releases happened at 75 to 85 degrees, almost vertical. The bomb fell nearly straight down. Wind and horizontal velocity became irrelevant. The trajectory was cleaner, simpler, more predictable. In other words, lower wasn't sloppier. It was better, and there was another advantage, one that explained Riley's survival. By beginning his pull-out later and performing it more gradually, he spread the G-load across a longer time frame, 7 or 8 seconds instead of 4. The total force was the same, but the peak intensity was much lower, roughly 412 Gs instead of 6 or 7. That kept him below the blackout threshold, allowing his cardiovascular system time to compensate and his muscles to maintain the anti-G strain. The math was undeniable. Riley's late pull dive not only improved accuracy, it kept pilots alive. Suddenly, the unthinkable had become clear. The Navy's cherished 2,500-foot release point, the rule every pilot had lived by, was based not on accuracy, but on fear. It had been chosen years earlier as a safety margin, assuming a fully conscious pilot could recover in time. But that assumption was fatally flawed. Now the truth was written in blood and mathematics alike. If dive bombing was to survive, the doctrine would have to change, completely. In the days that followed, the Anacostia Conference drafted a radical proposal. The Navy would test Riley's delayed pull-out technique under controlled conditions. If it proved viable, it would become the new standard. For every carrier air group in the fleet, Commander Flatley, the same officer who had first sounded the alarm months earlier, was chosen to lead the trials. His orders were simple: rebuild the way America trained its dive bomber pilots from the ground up. But what he and his instructors would soon discover at Naval Air Station Jacksonville would not only save lives, it would redefine the limits of human flight. April 1943's Naval Air Station Jacksonville, Florida. The air was heavy with spring humidity, and the hangars smelled of oil, salt, and burned rubber. The Navy had turned this sleepy training base into a laboratory of survival. It was here that Commander James "Jimmy" Flatley arrived with a team of engineers, physiologists, and combat pilots, men who had watched too many friends vanish into the ocean without a trace. Their mission was as clear as it was daunting: prove that dive bombing could be made safe, without sacrificing its accuracy or lethality. Flatley was no theorist. He was one of the Navy's most decorated aviators, a veteran of Coral Sea and Midway. To his men, his word carried the weight of gospel. When he said a new doctrine was needed, the fleet listened. On his first morning at Jacksonville, Flatley gathered the instructors on the tarmac. Behind him stood a row of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, their canopies glinting in the sun. He looked over the flight line and said quietly, "Gentlemen, we've lost more pilots to our own training than to the Japanese. That ends here. From that day forward, every sortie flown from Jacksonville would be recorded, measured, and studied like a scientific experiment." The first task was simple in theory: verify Riley's unorthodox delayed pull-out technique. The engineers mounted new pressure sensors in the cockpits, while Navy flight surgeons wired pilots with heart monitors and respiration belts. Every dive was filmed from the ground and from chase planes. The pilots began cautiously, 70-degree dives, then 75, then steeper. Each time they held the bomb release point lower, inching closer to the water. The results were astonishing. Those who had once blacked out at 6 Gs now completed dives at 4-1 or 2 with full control. Bombing accuracy improved by nearly 40%. The human body, it turned out, could handle extreme stress, if given just a little more time to adapt. But the real revolution wasn't in the numbers. It was in the mindset. For years, naval aviators had been taught that courage meant endurance, fighting through the blackout, forcing the dive longer, holding the stick harder. Now they learned that survival wasn't about toughness. It was about control, breathing, and precision. Dr. John Jack Hauser, one of the Navy's pioneering flight surgeons, led the physiological studies. He realized that pilots could fight off blackouts by consciously managing blood flow. He devised a breathing technique, a sequence of sharp exhales and muscle, tensing during pullout and to keep oxygen circulating to the brain. It became known as the anti-G straining maneuver. Hauser's team also modified the pilot harnesses, adding thicker shoulder straps and tighter lap belts to keep blood from pooling in the lower body during high G turns. Small changes, but together they transformed the limits of what a human could endure. Flatley didn't just want new data. He wanted a new generation of pilots who understood why the old ways were deadly. He ordered that every flight instructor at Jacksonville undergo the same physiological training. Within weeks, the base had become something closer to a research institute than a naval air station. Instructors lectured on baroreceptor response, venous return, and G-force tolerance, words that had never appeared in any flight manual before. The young cadets listened, half fascinated, half terrified. They knew they were the first generation of aviators being trained, under a doctrine written by blood and science combined, in the training pits and open fields ringed with bomb targets. The new method was tested day after day. Dive bombers rolled in from 12,000 feet, screaming toward the bullseye with engines throttled back, bombs armed, and altimeters ticking down like time bombs. Observers with stopwatches and cameras measured everything: dive angles, release altitudes, G-loads, recovery times. At first, the results were uneven. Some pilots released too low and pulled out too late. Others instinctively reverted to the old habits drilled into them since flight school. But gradually, precision returned. With each flight, they grew more confident. They learned that a 1/700-foot release followed by a smooth, deliberate pull produced both higher accuracy and a lower physiological toll. The sea, once a graveyard for training errors, became instead a proving ground for a safer future. By midsummer, word of the Jacksonville experiments reached Washington. Rear Admiral John Towers, chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, personally flew down to witness the trials. Standing beside Flatley on the observation deck, Towers watched as a Dauntless roared into a vertical dive. The plane seemed to hang in the air, nose pointing straight at the target. At barely 2,800 feet, the bomb released, a silver blur that disappeared into the water with a flash of spray just meters from center. The Dauntless then leveled smoothly. No black smoke, no impact plume, no tragedy. Towers turned to Flatley and said, "If that's the new standard, Commander, you've just rewritten the manual." He was right. Within weeks, BUAir issued a formal directive to every carrier air group in the Pacific. All dive bombing training would adopt the revised low-release technique and incorporate the anti-G strain maneuver as standard practice. The order effectively replaced a decade of doctrine overnight, but rewriting the rulebook was only part of the transformation. The Navy also needed to modernize its aircraft to support the human body. The old Dauntless had been built tough, but it was never meant for 8G recoveries or sustained vertical dives. Engineers began developing a new model of carrier bomber with reinforced control surfaces, stronger hydraulic assists, and a cockpit layout optimized for visibility during steep dives. That aircraft would become the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, faster, heavier, and designed from the ground up to accommodate the lessons learned at Jacksonville. It wasn't loved by pilots, at least not at first. It was temperamental, difficult to handle, and heavier on the controls. But it was safer, engineered for survivability. The Helldiver could dive steeper, pull out cleaner, and maintain structural integrity under higher loads. Every bolt in that airplane carried the memory of the men who had died teaching the Navy how far the human body could bend before it. By September 1943, the new training system had spread across all U.S. naval air stations. At Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and San Diego, young cadets were now learning not only how to bomb a target, but how to survive the dive itself. Instructors emphasized rhythm, the breathing, the muscle tension, the timing of release and pullout. The art of dive bombing had become almost a science of self-preservation, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the fatality rate in dive bomber training dropped by more than half. To Flatley and his men, it was vindication. To the pilots who lived through it, it was salvation. Yet even as the Navy celebrated its success, darker questions lingered. If these deaths had been preventable all along, how many lives had been lost to ignorance? How many letters home had been written because of a doctrine no one had dared to question? Flatley carried those questions with him long after the war ended. He would later call those months at Jacksonville the most important battle I ever fought, not against an enemy nation, but against the limits of human endurance and institutional pride. Because sometimes, he said, the hardest enemy to defeat is the one that wears your own uniform. Pacific Ocean, early 1944. The blue expanse stretched endlessly beneath the carriers of Task Force 58. The Japanese Empire still held vast territories, but the balance had begun to shift. Across those waters, the air groups trained at Jacksonville were now flying into combat, armed not just with bombs, but with a new understanding of how to survive the dive. From the USS Essex to the Bunker Hill, the lessons of Florida had traveled halfway around the world. Every squadron briefed its men the same way: lower release, smoother recovery, controlled breathing. The new doctrine was no longer theory. It was about to face the unforgiving test of war. Truck Lagoon, February 17, 1944. At dawn, an armada of American carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft toward what the Navy called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It was Japan's major forward base, a fortress of battleships, cruisers, and airfields. Among the first to dive were the veterans of Bombing Squadron 9. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander George "Swede" Larson, had spent weeks retraining his men in the Jacksonville method. He knew the old habits could still kill even in combat. At 15,000 feet, Larson's formation rolled inverted and dove, the sky filled with tracer fire and bursts of flak. The dive angle steepened beyond 75 degrees. For the Japanese gunners below, the sight was terrifying. Dauntless and Helldiver bombers descending almost vertically, their dive brakes glowing red with friction heat. At 2,000 feet, the bombs released, precisely as the new doctrine dictated. From the carrier decks, the observers saw the explosions walk perfectly across the anchorage. The light cruiser Katori, the destroyer Fumizuki, and several merchant ships erupted in flames. In the after-action report, Larson wrote a single line that told the story: no blackouts, no losses in the dive, accuracy unprecedented. The success at Truck proved what the Jacksonville training had promised, that the human body, when properly conditioned and disciplined, could perform miracles of precision under extreme pressure. As the island-hopping campaign pressed westward, through the Marshalls, Marianas, and the Philippines, the same story repeated again and again. Helldivers dove lower and steeper than any bomber before them, and yet far fewer pilots lost consciousness. The Navy's dive bombing accuracy, once averaging 25%, climbed to over 60%. Enemy shipping lanes, once safe behind screens of anti-aircraft fire, became death traps. Even Japanese intelligence took notice. In intercepted radio messages, officers described American dive bombers as ghosts from the sky, silent until the moment of impact, too fast and too precise to intercept. But behind every successful attack was a routine that seemed almost mundane: the anti-G breathing, the muscle tension, the timed pull-out. Each pilot was carrying Jacksonville with him into Battle d'Ar June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippines. Hundreds of aircraft roared across the sky in what would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Amid the chaos, the dive bombers played a decisive role. Lieutenant James H. Minnie, flying from the carrier Lexington, led his section against a Japanese carrier formation spotted west of Saipan. As they began their attack run, Minnie's wingman Ensign Carter called out over the radio, his voice tight but steady: "Starting my straining maneuver. 2,000 feet to release." Even in the heat of combat, he followed his training to the letter. Minnie's bomb struck the carrier Hio square amidships. The explosion ripped through the hangar deck, igniting aviation fuel. Within minutes, the ship was an inferno. Carter's bomb hit close astern. Both aircraft pulled out smoothly, engines roaring. The pilots fully conscious. Not a single member of their section was lost. That day, American dive bombers crippled or destroyed 3 Japanese carriers, the backbone of Japan's naval air power. In Flatley's post-war memoir, he wrote of that moment with quiet pride. "Every pilot who came home from the Philippine Sea owed his life to what we learned in those months at Jacksonville." As the war thundered toward its climax, the training program evolved even further. At forward bases on Ulithi and Guam, flight surgeons built mobile physiology labs to keep aircrews conditioned for high-G flight. They used primitive centrifuge rigs and even improvised water tank simulations to mimic blackout conditions. Pilots were drilled on their breathing patterns before every major strike. The Navy began issuing new anti-G suits, fabric garments with bladder sections that could inflate around the legs and abdomen, automatically compressing the body under acceleration. The first versions were crude, often leaking air or bursting seams, but they marked a turning point. The principles first discovered in the dauntless dive were now laying the foundation for future jet-age aviation. By late 1944, dive bombing had reached its peak, both as an art and as a science. In October, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, Helldiver squadrons demonstrated just how far they'd come. The carrier Franklin's Air Group dove through layers of cloud and anti-aircraft fire to strike the Japanese battleship Yamashiro and cruiser Megami. Observers noted how synchronized the dives appeared, each aircraft descending in perfect rhythm, their bomb releases timed almost identically. It was precision born not just from courage but from calculation, physiology, and control. Pilots no longer blacked out. They didn't guess at their limits, and they understood them. The dive, once a blind leap into chaos, had become a controlled fall guided by science. When victory finally came in 1945, the men who had trained under the Jacksonville program returned home, some to teaching posts, others to the new jet schools that were beginning to form. Flatley's reports were archived at the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, and later, their findings became standard reference for every branch of aviation medicine. The Air Force and NASA would eventually cite those same studies when developing pilot conditioning for high altitude and spaceflight. What began as a desperate wartime investigation into unexplained crashes had quietly rewritten the future of flight itself. Years later, in 1956, during a Navy reunion at Pensacola, a surviving dauntless pilot, now gray-haired and stooped, raised his glass during a toast and said, "We didn't know it then, but Jacksonville saved more pilots than any escort fighter ever could." Around the table, men nodded. They remembered the faces of those who hadn't made it, the ones who had paid for every discovery in blood and silence. They understood something few others did, that progress in war often comes not from invention, but from understanding the human being inside the machine. By then, the Dauntless had long been retired, replaced by sleeker jets and guided weapons. But in every cockpit, the principles remained the same: the rhythm of breathing, the control of G-forces, the awareness of the body's limits. Even modern fighter pilots, pulling 9 Gs in supersonic turns, still used techniques born from those early Navy experiments. It was the same human struggle, only faster and higher, the legacy of men who refused to accept that blackout was just a part of flying. Flatley's wartime files ended with a single handwritten line in the margin of his final report: "The machine will always push harder than the man, unless the man learns how to push back." And that was the heart of it. The Navy's dive-bombing revolution wasn't just about airplanes or tactics. It was about endurance, the realization that technology alone could not win wars unless the people inside the cockpit were understood, protected, and trained to survive their own machines. That revelation would echo through the coming decades, from the thunder of propellers to the roar of jet engines, from the decks of carriers to the black silence of space. Washington, D.C., or autumn 1945. The war was over. The parades were done, and in offices across the capital, a quiet reckoning began. The Navy, flush with victory, turned its gaze inward to analyze how it had survived, what it had learned, and what it must never forget. Among the countless reports stacked in the Bureau of Aeronautics archives was a thin, gray folder marked simply, Physiological Study, NAS Jacksonville, 1943. To most clerks, it was just another wartime study among thousands, but inside, in pages yellowed by time and sweat, lay the blueprint for the future of aviation medicine. Those papers, Flatley's diagrams, Hauser's notes, the blood pressure charts from the dauntless cockpits, would quietly shape every pilot training program that followed. They told a story of courage not only in battle, but in understanding the fragile limits of the human body. In the immediate post-war years, America's focus shifted from propellers to jets. Aircraft that once strained to reach 350 miles per hour now blasted past 600. The new challenge wasn't flak or engine failure, it was physiology. The transition was brutal. Pilots accustomed to steady piston engines suddenly found themselves in machines that accelerated like bullets. The G-forces came faster, harder, more violently, and once again men began losing consciousness, just as their predecessors had in the dive bombers of 1943. But this time, the Navy was ready. At the Naval Air Medical Research Institute in Pensacola, the lessons of Jacksonville became doctrine. The same anti-G straining maneuvers were now taught to jet pilots. Engineers used Flatley's G-load data to design improved harness systems and cockpit layouts. And the crude G-suits tested in the Pacific evolved into standard-issue pressure garments with automatic air bladders. Every generation of pilot that followed owed its survival to the discoveries made by those men who once dove toward the sea in the SBD. Dauntless, by 1947, as the Cold War dawned, the U.S. military began formalizing its aviation medical standards. The newly formed U.S. Air Force adopted Navy data directly, merging it with its own jet research. Together they founded the foundation of what would become aerospace physiology. It wasn't just about surviving flight anymore. It was about pushing human limits, reaching higher, faster, farther than ever imagined. And as experimental aircraft like the Bell X-1 began to approach the speed of sound, the same old questions returned. How much could the human body take before it failed? The answer once again began in the dive. In 1949, Dr. Jack Hauser, now head of Naval Aviation Medicine, presented his findings at a symposium of flight surgeons and engineers. His message was simple but profound. Every blackout that once claimed a pilot's life taught us something about what keeps him conscious. Every mistake was a step toward survival. He traced a direct line from the dive bombers of World War II to the test pilots of the jet age. Chuck Yeager, who broke the sound barrier that same year, used the same breathing and muscle tension techniques pioneered at Jacksonville. In the decades that followed, those principles became universal, adopted not just by military pilots but by astronauts, surgeons, and even race car drivers. The concept of G-tolerance, once an obscure naval problem, had become a cornerstone of human performance science. But while aviation surged forward, few remembered where it had begun. By the 1950s, the SBD Dauntless sat forgotten in museums and scrapyards. The word dive bomber sounded almost ancient, a relic of a slower, more desperate war. But in laboratories, centrifuge chambers, and flight schools, its legacy quietly endured. At the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute, instructors kept a photograph on the wall, a grainy image of a Dauntless caught mid-dive, bomb doors open, the ocean rushing up beneath it. Below it hung a small brass plaque, NAS Jacksonville 1943, where the science of survival was born. Every trainee who passed through those halls learned what that meant. They learned that flight was never just about engines and wings. It was about the human being strapped inside. Flatley himself lived long enough to see the age of supersonic flight. He retired as a vice admiral, decorated and respected, but he rarely spoke about the war. When he did, it was never about Midway or the great carrier battles. It was about Jacksonville. In a 1959 interview, he said quietly, "We thought we were teaching men how to fly. What we really learned was how to keep them alive." To him, that was the true victory. That the Navy had not just built better machines, but had finally understood the men who flew them. Meanwhile, the science continued to evolve. During the 1960s, NASA built on the Navy's groundwork to prepare astronauts for the brutal accelerations of launch and re-entry. Engineers studying G-forces in fighter cockpits now applied those same lessons to spacecraft cabins. The centrifuges that spun naval aviators in Pensacola became prototypes for astronaut training, simulators. The physiological charts from the Dauntless era, once drawn by hand with fountain pens, were now reproduced in scientific journals, referenced by biomedical engineers designing everything from ejection seats to life support systems. The lineage was unbroken. From a 1943 Florida airfield to the moon. By the 1970s, the story of the blackout dives was almost forgotten, buried beneath newer wars and faster planes. But among aviation historians, the Jacksonville experiments became legendary. They called it the forgotten revolution. A transformation born not from invention, but from necessity, when pilots refused to accept that dying in training was just part of the job. Each discovery had been carved from tragedy. The unexplained crashes, the pilots who never pulled out, the blackouts that left no witnesses. Yet from that suffering came something enduring, a foundation for every pilot who would ever face the crushing forces of gravity in flight. In 1988, the Navy dedicated a small memorial at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. It stood beside the old runway near where the dauntless squadrons had once taken off. The bronze plaque bore no grand titles, just a simple inscription. In memory of those who dove beyond the limit so that others might return. Veterans came from across the country to attend. Some leaned on canes, others in uniform again for the first time in decades. They spoke softly of the friends they'd lost and the lessons learned at such terrible cost. When the bugler played taps, the crowd fell silent, not in mourning, but in reverence. Because they knew that those sacrifices had not vanished into history, they had become the invisible armor worn by every pilot who followed. Today, the legacy of that forgotten experiment lives on in ways few recognize. Every time a modern fighter pilot withstands 9 Gs in a high-speed turn without losing consciousness, every time an astronaut survives the crushing acceleration of a rocket launch, they are carrying a fragment of the knowledge born at Jacksonville in 1943. Every pulse monitor, every anti-G suit, every line in a pilot's medical manual owes something to those early pioneers who refused to let physics dictate fate. The Dauntless is long gone. The ocean it once dove toward has long since forgotten the wrecks that rest beneath it, but its story remains, etched in every flight that pushes the edge of human endurance. In the end, history remembered the great battles, Midway, Coral Sea, Leyte Gulf, as turning points of the war. But the quiet transformation at NAS Jacksonville was something deeper. It was a turning point of understanding. The day the Navy stopped asking, "How do we fight?" and began asking, "How do we survive?" That single question would define every generation of aviator to come, from the roaring decks of World War II to the silent void of space.